Today's lecture provides an introduction to international relations theory and human rights. We'll first consider some of the potential causes of human rights violations, then consider different international relations theories that attempt to explain the origins of international human rights laws and institutions, and how those laws and institutions affect or impact the behavior of governments. And we'll conclude with a few practical examples of how these international relations theories would affect the design or structure of different human rights monitoring mechanisms, which will be the subject of the remainder of our discussion this week. Let's begin with an overview of some of the potential causes of human rights violations. You see that I grouped them into three categories: political explanations, economic explanations, and cultural and ideological explanations. These are all very different rationales for why states might violate international human rights law. Political explanations go primarily to the nature of the government and the type of threats, whether internal or external, that government is facing. Economic explanations focus on the degree of development as well as levels of inequality within a state, as well as how exposed a state is to international institutions such as the international trading system and international financial regulation. Cultural and ideological explanations look at more deeply ingrained patterns of beliefs about different groups within a society, and whether those beliefs create some sort of predisposition to dehumanize or treat particularly minority groups as less deserving of protection of basic rights and freedoms. I want to say that these different explanations are not mutually exclusive. That is to say, a particular set of human rights violations in a particular country might be due to one, two, or even all three of these different potential causes. Nevertheless, it may be that one factor predominates in a particular context, and therefore it's worth understanding some of the theories that draw on these different explanations to attempt to predict when states will adhere to their human rights obligations and when they might violate those obligations. So let's take a look at three major schools of international relations theory that attempt to explain the origins and impact of international human rights law and institutions. And those three schools are realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Now, each of these schools try to identify with some degree of precision the situations in which international human rights laws and institutions will actually change the behavior of governments and their officials. So they recognize the possibility that certain international human rights laws or institutions would not change that behavior from what it would otherwise have been, or would not change it much. So they're opening up the question of how legal norms and institutions influence state behavior. And that's a very important question for anyone attempting to engage in legal or political change to promote greater respect for human rights. And I think what's most interesting about these theories is that each of them has a different set of hypotheses about the actors who either support or oppose international human rights, as well as their incentives for opposing or supporting international human rights, and also theories about the mechanisms that can be used to explain how these rules and institutions do or do not change the behavior of governments. Let me summarize for you very briefly in the chart that you see before you some of the suppositions or hypotheses of each of these three schools of international relations theory. So you see, with respect to realism, I'll start on the first row and then work down. The primary actors for this theory are nation states, and the principal incentives for nation states are to provide a way to change the behavior of weaker actors, governments that don't have as much power, to behave in a way that would be beneficial to the interests or the desires of the more powerful countries. So you see that I have referred to this incentive in the top row middle column as other binding. and that's because in this situation the powerful are attempting to bind or constrain the behavior of the weak. And the specific mechanisms by which the powerful attempt to shape the behavior of the weak are coercion through threats, potential sanctions, or even payoffs. It could be financial remuneration, or aid and trade decisions are made in such a way as to influence weaker states in how they respond to international human rights rules and institutions. Realism has the most long-standing pedigree in international relations, but I think one of the challenges it faces is how to explain why powerful nations would bind themselves to international human rights treaties and participate in international human rights institutions. Liberalism, the second international relations theory, does have an answer to that question. Liberalism looks at the primary actors not as nation states, but as different branches of domestic governments within a particular state. And here, these governments will accept international human rights norms and institutions for self-interested reasons, in particular to lock in democracy and the rule of law so that there won't be any backsliding from those kinds of commitments domestically over time. That's why this theory is often referred to as self-binding. That is, government actors bind themselves and their successors in order to promote human rights enhancing democratic values and the rule of law over time. The primary mechanisms by which these actors do this would be the incorporation of international human rights laws and institutions into domestic legal systems, and also by providing a way for individuals on their own, private actors, to engage in litigation against governments who have allegedly violated their human rights. That litigation could occur at the domestic level or at the international level, and we'll look at examples of both in the coming weeks. The third theory, constructivism, looks at the primary actors as being non-state or civil society groups or NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And the incentives for these actors to promote human rights are a belief in the value of the ideas that they embody. So these actors want to bind themselves, and they also want to bind others. That's why I've listed in that middle column this idea as both self-binding and other-binding. And the way that these actors attempt to achieve this result is through tools such as publicity, persuasion, naming and shaming, identifying violators, and attempting to persuade them through pressure and through incentives to change their views about the benefits versus the costs of complying with international human rights institutions. This provides you a very brief overview of the three different theories, and they're very interesting in the abstract, but I think it's also worth thinking about what sorts of practical applications these theories might have if we're thinking about the structure or design of international institutions to monitor state behavior. So I've listed for you on this slide a number of different applications or implications of the three theories. If realism, for example, explains the changes in international human rights law and in state behavior, then policymakers that want to promote changes in behavior that further enhance the protection of human rights should focus on institutions that facilitate or enable interstate interactions so that the powerful can exercise their authority over the weak and make the weaker nations adhere to international human rights standards through the exercise of that power or coercion. If liberalism explains these changes in behavior, then those policymakers who favor international human rights law should focus on domesticating those laws into national legal systems and also providing enhanced mechanisms for litigation of human rights cases in courts. Finally, if constructivism explains these changes, then policymakers ought to support ways for NGOs and other civil society groups to publicize rights violations, to engage in the kind of persuasion and naming and shaming that was referred to in the previous slide. So these are some practical applications of these theories, and we'll come back to different ways in which these theories can be observed as operating within some of the different international institutions that we'll talk about in the coming weeks. For now, I'll leave you with a number of other sources analyzing the application of international relations theories of different sorts to the international human rights system.